but welcome everybody. So far I think we've got folks coming from, we have South America, Africa, and Asia, and of course, North America. I don't know if anybody's calling in from Australia. That would be, we want to cover the world here, but wonderful to have you all join wherever you're calling in from. Super, super. Yes, Rome, right, Europe, I forgot Europe. How could I forget Europe? Rome also, very, very envious. Great to have you. Oh, hi, Leona. It's wonderful to see lots of new and old friends. Joyce and everybody. Okay, another minute or so, just one more minute or so, and we're gonna get started. Thanks for your patience. Uganda, yay. Kazakhstan, fantastic. What time is it in Kazakhstan? Must be pretty late. Pakistan, definitely late there, Radhika, right? Ghana, fabulous. It's so nice to have this be truly a global event. All right, so we're going to get started here. Hello and welcome officially. And thank you so much for joining us from wherever you happen to be around the world. My name is Laura Ahern. I'm a technical director with social impact and formerly a developmental evaluator working on USAID's digital strategy implementation. It's very, very nice, as I've just been saying, to see new and old friends in the audience. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, which is entitled, as you can see on the screen, Developmental Evaluation, a Tool for Operational Effectiveness. This webinar is part of USAID's Agency Learning and Evidence Month. So next slide, please, Sharon. Here's a brief overview of what we hope to cover today. First, after I'll provide an overview of developmental evaluation, and then we'll move right into a panel discussion with our three esteemed panelists, followed by what we hope will be a vibrant Q&A session. At any time throughout the session, feel free to add your questions or comments in the chat, as you've all just been doing, and we hope to have a really active engagement in the chat. We'll keep an eye on the Q&A feature. Zoom has a Q&A feature, but for the most part, the chat is where it's going to be at today. So we welcome your participation there. And because we're using Zoom as a platform, you won't be able to raise your hand or come off mute. So unfortunately, there won't be that opportunity to participate, but we hope that you will participate very actively in the chat. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you. Here we have the big question. What is developmental evaluation, or DE as it's called? Admittedly, DE is not the most felicitously named evaluation approach. Basically, DE is a type of evaluation that is designed to support innovation in complex environments. And here, complex means wherever there is an unclear relationship between causes and effects. So DE supports learning and operational effectiveness in a variety of ways. It can be a way to put CLA into practice, collaborating, learning, and adapting into practice. It can be a way to deal with complexity, and it can allow you to get more out of an evaluation than you would normally get. DE supports continuous adaptation in complex dynamic situations and allows for collaboration and co-creation with stakeholders. I like to think of DE as having an embedded adaptive management advisor who has expertise in evaluation and evaluative thinking, and also CLA and learning. Now, DE might sound like something that's either unusual or maybe even unorthodox, but as it says right here at the bottom with the little icon of the unicorn, the ADS 201, USAID's policy, recognizes developmental evaluation as one form of performance evaluation. So we have that validation. Next slide, please. To talk a little bit about how DE is similar to or different from standard traditional forms of evaluation, we have a table here. So traditional formative and summative evaluations, which you can see on the left-hand side of the table, emphasize accountability and focus on improving final outcomes. DE, on the right side there in the blue, is also interested in improving outcomes, but less for the sake of accountability and more to overcome challenges through innovation. Now, when it comes to standards and methods, in traditional evaluation, the evaluator is external and independent, and methods are held constant from the beginning to the end of the evaluation. In DE, the evaluator is still independent, but also embedded and can change methods based on needs. It's very responsive in that respect. Where the evaluator is embedded can vary. It could be in a USAID mission or Washington office, for example, as was the case for the digital strategy DE, or with an implementing partner. There are other alternatives as well. As for evaluation results and products, traditional evaluation still, all too often, I would say, produces a one-time 35-page-ish report that can unfortunately sit on a shelf gathering dust. But developmental evaluations provide continuous feedback, often through many concise, visually appealing, and utilization-focused learning products. This sort of flexibility really supports adaptive management. So all of these are reasons why DE addresses this learning question from the agency's learning agenda that just popped up on the bottom of the screen there. And it is, how can USAID better streamline systems, processes, and resources to meet long-term needs identified by missions, while enabling the flexibility to respond quickly to unexpected shifts in contexts? So with that, I am going to shift now to panelists. And I know you all probably have lots of questions. So again, please add them into the chat as you go through. And you probably have questions, given that I just breezed through that overview. So we have three expert panelists to answer some questions. Joining us are Shannon Griswold, a senior learning advisor on the CLA team in USAID's Policy Planning and Learning Bureau. Chris Thompson, a technical director in Social Impacts Strategy Planning and Learning Division. And Danny De Garcia, the vice president of Social Impacts Strategy Planning and Learning Division. Welcome, esteemed panelists. Let's start by having each of you describe briefly your experiences with developmental evaluation, or DE, starting with Shannon.
Sure. Thanks for having me here. I really have been a long-term champion of developmental evaluations, or DEs. Previous to being in PPL LER, and I noticed this didn't get into my signature, which is my oversight, I sit on the program cycle support team, of which we have some practice areas of monitoring, evaluation, and CLA. I try to kind of bridge the gap between our CLA and our evaluation work, because I used to be in the evaluation office in the Global Development Lab, where we started piloting DEs under our Monitoring, Evaluation, Research, and Learning Innovations program about 8 years ago. So I've been the COR for that contract that's been piloting DEs for a number of years. And under that contract, I've also been sort of on the USAID side, kind of overseeing one of our efforts to try this within USAID. So we had an embedded evaluator in the Global Development Lab who was helping us assess and adapt the ways that we as a USAID Washington office engaged successfully with our field missions, particularly around uptake of innovations. And so that was a really great experience for us to kind of just see how DEs worked and sort of adapt the approach and make sure it fit and met the needs of USAID. And I would say we also got quite a lot out of that in terms of improving our engagement between the field and Washington with an eye towards that sustainable uptake of innovations.
Great, thanks, Shannon. And we will be hearing more about your experience shortly. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with DEs?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Laura. It's great to be here. I think I'm here because I served as the chief of party of a developmental evaluation in Indonesia that USAID was using to assist with maternal and newborn health. And now I write a little bit on developmental evaluation for USAID's Learning Lab. I'm mentoring an embedded evaluator in Somalia, working on a USAID peacebuilding activity. And I am advising the city of Portland on their anti-gun violence programming through a developmental evaluation. So sort of putting it into practice on a daily basis. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Chris. Danny, your experience with DE.
Sure, thanks all. I'm Danny de Garcia. My experience with DE, I have served as the project director, kind of providing oversight, background, guidance to the DEPA Merle contract, which Shannon mentioned was this kind of umbrella under the Merlin Innovations work through the formerly the lab and now PPL, where we have piloted developmental evaluations in missions, in USAID headquarters, et cetera. Beyond that, I also work as an advisor and technical expert on a number of developmental evaluations, including the one Chris mentioned for the city of Portland, but also for the UN, particularly as they were looking at their COVID response in the early days of the pandemic.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Now, we are going to turn to a couple of questions, and we're going to get to some questions in the chat as well. So once again, please feel free. I see Silva's comment / question there as well. We'll get to that. Yes. So first question, and I'm going to ask Chris to start with this. We just recently said, I just said that developmental evaluations flexibility supports adaptive management and improves operational effectiveness, et cetera. What does that look like in practice? Chris?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to lead with, Laura, because it relates right back to the agency's primary learning question and how developmental evaluation can help. Well, I can tell you how USAID is using DE in its peacebuilding activities in Somalia, and they're trying to affect attitudinal changes between communities and clans. So quite important work. And we really ran into the limitations of traditional monitoring and evaluation, right? So if you're trying to change attitudes and you want to do that through traditional evaluation, the quickest you're going to be able to measure that attitude change, right, is maybe after a year or two, if you're doing a midline evaluation. Or if you're using traditional monitoring, say a performance indicator, you could maybe measure these kind of changes on a quarterly basis. But that's not really useful, right? Whenever you're doing this work between groups and trying to build empathy, you want to be looking and gathering feedback much more rapidly, right? Because there could be unintended outcomes. There could be unintended consequences, right? These might be positive, an unexpected opportunity for reconciliation, or they might be negative, right? Or yeah, I mean, it's Somalia, so the operating context changes quite rapidly, and what worked yesterday might not work today for a number of reasons, right? So USAID's using a developmental evaluation to go to intervention sites weeks, just weeks, not years, not quarters or months, weeks after the original intervention, some of this single identity work around changing attitudes and getting that feedback to management in a span of weeks, right, rather than quarters. So I think that's what we talk about, flexibility and some of the what rapid feedback can bring to programs seeking to move flexibly and adaptively. Thanks, Laura.
Great, Chris. Danny, do you have anything to add to this question about how DE can support adaptive management and operational effectiveness?
Sure. I mean, I think when we talk about this learning question of operational effectiveness, this second half of the question is that adaptation, and DE is made for these types of opportunities. So what Chris is doing in Somalia is a great example. I think it also works even a level up. So the work that I mentioned with UNICEF, when COVID-19 hit, there was a lot of information and some learning that had been done by the organization, I think, particularly around the Ebola response. But that wasn't necessarily perfectly applicable to COVID. And as they were trying to figure out how to respond to the COVID pandemic, both as it related to, how do they, devolve authority or empower their local offices and local staff members? How do they adjust to working from home? How are they learning from the data that's coming in? I mean, it was an influx of data for a long time to be able to adapt their, supply chain on how to provide mechanisms. So DE is really wonderfully suited to be able to kind of take information as it comes, feed it back to stakeholders and help them pivot. And based on that pivot, now what do we do? Is that working? Should we try something else? So it's a really kind of exciting way to be able to respond to shifts that you might not even see coming.
So I see a couple of questions in this chat that are relevant to what we were just saying about this question of like rapid feedback, which is a key component of DE. Chris, how many weeks? You mentioned weeks. How does that process last? Or how does it work overall? And then also maybe some comments, and I'll open it up to Shannon also after Chris, about what the difference might be between DE and maybe some other rapid evaluations. And is it fair to say that DE is an approach to evaluation rather than a type of evaluation? Any thoughts on that, Chris, especially first with you and Somalia?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll touch on Michelle's question, which is a great one, and then Daniel on some terminology questions. Michelle, I was typing away in the chat to get a response back to you. Right now, we're sort of seeing this as reoccurring rounds, right? Whenever communities receive the the treatment of this attitudinal and behavior change type work, right? So for the first year, it would be sort of, I think, every other month in some of these communities that are being worked with. But then that would change as the it's a people to people peace building model. So as that shifts away from the single identity work to starting to bring communities and in Somalia's case, clans and subclans together around some interventions to support livelihood, right? The DE would change and adapt to that. So it wouldn't be this rapid cadence that we're seeing in year one, would change as the program goes along, right? And this is maybe speaking to Valerie's question on the difference between DE and rapid cycle evaluations, right? Whereas a DE can just speed up data collection and feedback, it can also adapt to other challenges, right? So right now we're seeing we need that flexibility, right? But in the future, in 2 years, there might be another component of the program that needs to be focused on to support innovation, and DE can do that, right? It's bringing more than just rapid feedback to the conversation. Is DE an approach to evaluation? We call it an approach. USAID, it is a type of performance evaluation recognized in ADS 201, which I think is the important thing for our work. Thanks, Laura.
Great, thanks, Chris. Anything to add to that, Shannon?
Yeah, I think, to that point, and I see another question here about how is it different from complexity aware monitoring and evaluation techniques. I think we're talking a little bit about semantics and taxonomy here. And what I would say is that DE is both and one of the approaches to complexity aware monitoring and evaluation. And within DE, you can employ some of those other things that fall under that umbrella. And so DE is really, we like to say it's sort of methodologically agnostic. That doesn't mean it doesn't use real evaluation methodologies. It very much does. But when you are scoping a DE, typically you are not saying, right, we know we want a pre-post evaluation of these sample sets, etc. You're saying, we're not really sure how to answer a question that, and we know that our outcomes and our context may shift a little over time for this program. So help us kind of keep track of that as we go along and employ different rigorous evaluation methodologies per the emerging needs of the program. And so I would say it works well in complexity. So it's kind of fits under that umbrella, but it can also bring in other methodologies that fit under that umbrella, like outcome harvesting, like most significant change, etc. So it's a little bit of both.
Maybe if I can just jump in, it seems like a couple of folks are newer to DE. And so one of the things I would just highlight where the difference with a DE is that there's an embedded evaluator or team of embedded evaluators. And so what they're doing is they're sitting with these folks. And that could be the implementation team, it could be USAID teams, there's different people they can sit with, but they're really co-deciding, what's the question we're investigating, a line of inquiry or an evaluation question, answering it, feeding it back, and then seeing what new questions emerge and pivoting to that. And so Ariana, I see that you're asking, how does it enable that flexibility to respond quickly? It's because as new information comes, we can switch the question. We can answer one question and test out something new. Or we can change the focus and expand or broaden it if we uncover something really interesting. Or delete it entirely, say, okay, this is no longer relevant, the context is shifts, let's move to a different question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, all three of you. One phrase I hear a lot in USAID is we're building the plane as we fly it, right? That sort of sense that this is really complex and we're not exactly sure how this either program or maybe operational initiative or restructuring, how it's going to go. But we know we need to learn as we proceed. And DE is ideal for those sorts of complex situations. So let me continue to, first of all, please, to put questions in the chat. And it is very possible that we will answer as we go along. If we don't get to you right in real time here, we'll make an effort to go back during the Q&A, okay? So a second question is the challenging question of how DEs can help to streamline systems, processes, and or resources, so that operational effectiveness part of the agency learning agenda question. Shannon, I'm going to turn to you first on this. How can DE streamline systems, processes, and or resources?
Yeah, so this is a really great example that I love from the DE I mentioned at the outset, which was our sustained uptake DE. And like I said, that work was really about, we had a fairly new bureau at USAID at the time, our Global Development Lab, which was really charged with doing a lot of innovative work. So for which we didn't have a really well-established theory of change for a lot of these issues. We also had a lot of people who were new to USAID in the Bureau and didn't necessarily always understand systems and processes and resources at our field missions. And it was a really different way of working. And so we took a really deliberative approach to say, okay, we know that we have been charged to help our missions employ different innovations, and those ran the gamut from like technological, digital stuff to, design approaches, etc. So there was a whole very broad spectrum of things. How do we help our missions under the constraints they are working on really take some of these innovations on board in a way that's not just a flash in the pan for them? And so we embedded an evaluator in that bureau and really took an evidence-based approach to how are we trying to engage our missions with this, and in which cases are we successful, and which cases are we not, and why? And so over time, with that evaluation, I believe we employed at least 3 different evaluation methodologies. And I'll ask Danny to chime in here because it's been a few years. But I think we used outcome harvesting, we used a positive deviance approach, and I believe sort of process tracing, was that right? Yeah. And so using that, those methodologies to examine the ways that our bureau back in Washington was engaging with our missions and looking at the outcomes that our missions were achieving in terms of adopting these innovations and being able to continue to use them over time, we were able to then produce an evidence-based, what we called, what do we call it? The mission engagement playbook, how an evidence-based guide to others back in Washington about how to effectively engage missions in a way that was less burdensome to missions and more effective at getting things kind of that sustained uptake in our field missions. And I will say too, like that had applications beyond just the life of the Global Development Lab. As many of you know, USAID reorganized a few years ago. That bureau was absorbed into other structures, but as a part of that, that mission engagement playbook informed a lot of the work that was done to kind of rejigger the way that all of our Washington bureaus now engage with our missions. And so this kind of stuff can be broadly applicable. And I was just really proud of the way that we took an evidence-based approach to that, really documented everything well. And instead of turning it into a fairly, detail-laden report, we turned it into a user guide. Here's something that's a job aid for other people to pick up and use. And so I think that was a really valuable experience.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Danny, anything you wanted to add there?
Sure. I mean, I think when we talk about operational effectiveness, often folks are thinking through, the money, the procurement, the contracting. And I saw some questions earlier about, how do we enable flexibility with some of those, are there types of contracts, are there types of processes that we have to have in place to make it possible, right? Because in our checks and balances and accountability side, there are certain things we need to do, but there's also, we want to be able to adapt and be effective. So we did one developmental evaluation for a project in Cambodia where, the developmental evaluation found out pretty early on that the way that it was actually an agreement, not a contract, but the way that project was set up, that agreement, it just was not effective. The prime implementing partner was not adding the value that some of the other organizations were, that it wasn't an effective use of resources. And what I thought was really interesting in this process, ultimately, because they had all the data from the developmental evaluation, they were able to restructure the award to be much more effective, to save the US government a lot of money to be more effective, but that took a long time. I think it took, Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, that one was 9 months or something like that before they were able to make the changes that kind of everybody knew needed to be made because of some of these bureaucratic hurdles. And so the developmental evaluation allowed it to happen, say, 4 years earlier than it would have otherwise, but it still wasn't, an immediate thing. And so I think this is something that, within the agency and as implementing partners, we're all trying to learn more from. Of, how can we structure contracts or awards or implementation such that it is easier to pivot? And we're seeing a lot of, I think, progress in that area of being able to, save money based on data, make processes more efficient. If the developmental evaluation says, hey, we should have it in this way, the contract or award is set up in such a way that they're able to do that. There's nice language that some are using around, some just deliverables, how they're structured. If it's, firm fixed price or, time and materials, there are implications to both of those. Or so learning around some of those. But what I think is interesting is, developmental evaluations can help to streamline those processes, can help save the government a lot of money. if everything's in place. But there's a flip side to that too. On the implementation side, needs to be set up in a way such that that's possible.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Anything anybody else wants to add to this question before we move on?
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize a point that I think Danny alluded to. There are some questions here in the chat about like the real mechanics and nuts and bolts of procurement. We don't have a specific, you should always do this kind of contract or this kind of COAG. The important thing is there are many ways to build in flexibility in your procurement. And we do have resources from within USAID that kind of speak to that. But the important thing is that it allows for flexibility, and you have an AO or SEO that it's willing to kind of build that flexibility in. And, you know, it's always easiest to do it in such a way that you don't have to do contract mods to contract modifications for those of you who are not fluent in USAID jargon. But like, it's just always easier if you build it in from the get-go, but there's no one correct way to do that.
Great. Thanks. So I keep the questions coming in the chat. I'm going to move on to another question that is relevant to some of the questions mentioned in the chat already. When is the right time to conduct a DE? Is it ever too early or too late to conduct a developmental evaluation? Yes, Chris, you have something here, or I'm sorry, did you come off mute? I'm sorry.
Accidentally, go ahead.
Okay, so maybe Danny or Shannon, you would like to speak to when it's most appropriate to conduct a DE.
Sure, I can jump in. So I think we know you don't want to conduct a DE too late, right? The idea behind developmental evaluation is that you're able to adapt. So if it's too late in the process, you're not able to adapt, it's too late. You're probably better served by more traditional forms of evaluation. On the too early side, I think most of us, piloting the DEPA contract, piloting developmental evaluations, thought, hey, there's no such thing as too early. You can build DE into the start of a program, the start of a process, and it can be really effective. We did have one experience though where we learned there are times that it's too early, and that's really if the decision makers aren't really in place yet, or the structure, you don't know who's able to make a decision based on the data. If that's not in place, it may actually be too early. I mean, you need to be able to have mechanisms in place such that when you collect information, it feeds into something, and somebody knows what to do with that information, or you know what data to collect. So we have examples where, it's worked really well built into the start, helping to make sure that as things ramp up, as we figure out our project, as we figure out implementation, it's really guided by evidence. And so it works really well. But you do need some kind of external factors or internal factors potentially in play to ensure that you can act on information.
Okay, thanks, Shannon.
Yeah, no, just to build on that, I think in Danny's example that she shared, we did try to do a developmental evaluation with one of our Washington operating units during the agency transformation, our reorganization process. And we actually thought that was going to be great because why wouldn't you want evidence to sort of guide and shape the way that you kind of form that office and kind of structure the goals and it seemed like a good idea, but to Danny's point, what we learned through that process is that sometimes during reorganizations, you have kind of a revolving door of people in different roles. And so it really was very hard to identify the decision maker who was going to be able to use the evidence to make these decisions. And once we did, then that person would move on to another role and it would change again. And so it was really hard to get traction in that circumstance. And so I think we generally say start DEs earlier rather than later so that you have time to adapt your program or your processes or your operations, whatever the target of your evaluation might be. But I think there is some care to be taken to make sure that you do have enough continuity in terms of decision makers in place. And we have some of this outlined, and I know we'll share these resources that we've learned over the 8 years that we've been piloting these DEs. What works and what doesn't, do's and don'ts, tips and tricks in some of our practical guides for evaluators and for evaluation administrators and funders. So we'll share those later.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Yes. And Chris, any thoughts on this issue of timing or any other related aspects of developmental evaluation?
Yeah, I would spin the question of, is it ever too early to do a developmental evaluation in a little bit more of maybe a humorous and helpful way? Sharon, if you want to go to the next slide. This question of timing, right, is one that confronts us fairly often. We've got a couple cartoons here to help us deal with it, right? I would say the developmental evaluation is ideally suited to deal with the uncertainty that comes early in a program, right? When you know there's a problem, you have a sketch of a work plan, right? And a few resources there to deal with it. I think that's exactly the right time to encourage developmental evaluation thinking and to maybe bring on an embedded evaluator to help with this. Right now, as Danny and Shannon mentioned, there are some cases where it is too early, and we're not presenting this as the be all end all cure all. But I think if we want to look at the components that all programs or operational units typically have, Sharon, if you want to flip to the next slide, DE does present a framework to help with each. And thanks, Sharon, for copy and pasting my responses in the chat. I was trying to respond to everybody, but I was responding only to hosts and panelists. So if you asked a question earlier, I think an answer might be coming in the chat. But so developmental evaluation works with the components, right, that all programs and operating units have, even early in trying to solve a problem or develop an initiative, right? So developmental evaluation helps leaders, no matter what stage they're at, stay true to their mission and principles, right? It informs decision-making through that rapid feedback that we spoke to earlier, and it gives people a voice in that feedback. There was a great question in the chat about, does DE take into consideration marginalized voices? I think we found, right, Danny, that the DE can be more inclusive than traditional evaluations, right? That often think, for example, of a key informant interview, right? They do a key informant interview with a marginalized group. And then that, just by the process of typical analysis for KIIs, that becomes equally weighted with like other stakeholders, interviews with funders. And those voices can be a bit lost just from the fact that they are marginalized. DE provides a way to elevate those voices, right? DE also works with processes and systems quite well by just recognizing that they're not linear, right? That they are dynamic and not fighting against that, like you can often see a traditional evaluation doing. And then it reinforces learning culture, right? By emphasizing innovation over accountability or compliance, I would say. So anyway, this is just a framework for looking at that. Thanks, Laura.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think we're going to sort of move over mostly to Q&A at this point. So if you haven't already added questions and you have them about DE, please feel free to put them into the chat. I'm going to start with just following on this question of when is it the right time to do a DE? Is it ever too early or too late? With maybe another question about relatively similar type of question. How long should a DE be? What's the appropriate duration? And then maybe a little bit more about the mechanics. We have some in the chat. There's some conversations in the chat about how do you select a DE and a developmental evaluator and put them on board, and then how long does that take? Who would like to answer this? Maybe Danny first, and then
Sure.
we can turn to Shannon.
Sure. So both the wonderful and frustrating thing about DEs is that the answer to most of your questions is going to be, it depends. DEs are so flexible and so adaptive to specific needs. So we've had DEs start at the inception of a process or project or activity and really help guide those decisions. We've also had some that start really late in the process and help look at sustainability and help look at how things are kind of gelling to finish it out, and everything in between. We've also, and we'll post some of these links. We did a look at 10 years of DE within the agency and found that there's just huge variation in terms of how long they last. I mean, there are DEs that are under a year long. We typically recommend them not to be too much shorter than a year, because in order to really be embedded and have people build you into the process and gain that trust and have that knowledge, it does take time and you see added benefits. A lot of DEs start as a year and then end up finding a lot of utility and extending, and maybe even extending 2 or 3 or 4 times. We've seen that quite often. So we've seen, 1 to maybe 6 years might be the latest one or the longest one that we've seen. And we'll post that link there, but there's a huge variety. In terms of the kind of logistics, again, there's variety. I mean, Chris's team in Indonesia was a team of, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, I think 5 embedded evaluators. Others are a part-time embedded evaluator. Most often we've seen 1 embedded evaluator with a number of kind of support, surge support types of staff, people able to jump in if all of a sudden there's a need for a lot more data collection or analysis or a specialized skill set. But it really depends on the need, where the decision points are, where the process or activity is in that kind of life cycle.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Anything to add, Shannon or Chris?
Yeah, no, I think Danny got it right. I mean, DEs tend to be bespoke, and so it depends. But we do try to build them in a way that is going to fit the needs of the program. And as Danny said, oftentimes we get early, like we know we want to do this for a year because we think that's going to give us time, and often those get extended because, gosh, this really is useful.
Great. Yes. And so I see another question or a set of questions related to, I think we're all still, well, many audience members are still trying to envision what it can look like given this wide range of methods, approaches, data sources, numbers of people, etc. And Daniel asks, it's still trying to get a mental map of a DE. Is it he says, I think the key thing is that an embedded evaluator a DE is an embedded evaluator who quickly and flexibly takes on different types of evaluations. It sounds like that is basically what it is, an embedded evaluator. Is that a synonym for a DE? Any thoughts on this? And I'm going to, Shannon, yes.
Yeah, I would say kind of yes, and like that is pretty much the key hallmark that distinguishes it from other types of evaluation that can adapt or that can inform adaptation. I think the other piece is the complexity and the innovation that is sort of the intent behind it. But yes, in terms of what makes a DE and how do we recognize one when we see it, I would say that embedded evaluator is kind of what sets it apart from other pieces. And yes, making sure that you're not, I mean, you could do this, you could embed an evaluator for a really like predefined, type of program and type of evaluation. I just don't know that would bring you a lot of value add. Whereas if you're embedding an evaluator for something where you're like, gosh, the outcomes are uncertain, or the cause and effect particularly is uncertain, and we have some flexibility to try new things and adapt, like that's where it's most useful. Great.
Thanks. Danny, you were going to add something.
Just going to say, if you get into the details of it, DE has guiding principles that really is about this utilization and all these other things. So I would wholeheartedly agree with Shannon's, yes and piece. But in a lot of these questions, I mean, we're really talking about what's driving the adaptive management, the operational effectiveness. And so there's a lot of debate on, the terminology and where developmental evaluation stands. And it's important to some extent, but now that it's been accepted by by USAID, I would encourage people to kind of not get hung up on some of those, on some of the nomenclature, and really think about, the approach and whether it's useful and how it feeds into your processes.
Great, thanks. Chris?
Yeah, if I could come off here and actually just underscore something that Shannon mentioned about just how many of these DEs get extended, once they're going, right, which is usually a clear indication of their value and them being indispensable. That caused me to jump and reach for my a little data point that we gathered earlier, right? So we found that USAID conducted 14 developmental evaluations between 2010 and 2020. And at least half of these received extensions. So 7 received extensions, and 4 of those 7 received costed extensions. So the willingness was there to commit and further invest in these. And the real number might actually be greater, because when I was trying to develop this data point, not all of these 14 DEs got back to me. So anyway, it is there. Thanks for letting me jump in there, Laura.
Great, sure. Thanks, Chris and everybody. So there are some questions here that I will get to about budget in a moment, but I also wanted to address some of the questions on is it possible to have a developmental evaluator be already somebody on your staff? And a related question about collaboration between perhaps an external evaluator and an internal MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning staff. Is there some sort of right way to do it, or some ways we can think of that might work along those lines?
Sure, I can jump in just because we've looked at this through the DEPA contract. And in that 10 years of DE study, you'll see, or document that we copied in the chat, there's also some examples there. We have case studies that we've done. I think there's generally a variety of ways you can implement, and we have seen some kind of internal DEs done by an implementing organization themselves. There are pros and cons of this. We do have, I think, of a blog post that was on the Learning Lab that has some good kind of a table to lay that out. Maybe somebody can put that in the chat. But really, in the internal DEs, what we found, there's some benefits. It's easier to embed folks. They'll trust you. You're part of the same organization. You might have kind of quicker access. You don't need to, get the right email address and figure out the seating and get people to invite you to the meetings. The downside is often it's easy for the DE to bleed into other things, for people to want that person to do more traditional monitoring and evaluation. It is harder if there are hard findings. So for example, an internal DE might have not been able to say, hey, this structure is ineffective and this organization shouldn't be in this position, right? Their incentives are tied to still having a job, or even to their, the power dynamics at play with their boss. So it's a lot harder for some of those kind of hard findings to come out and come through and be put into action. But it's definitely possible, and you've seen some good examples of that being implemented in the agency and being implemented effectively. I think one of the other things we found is that it's really crucial to have some support staff. So even internal DEs, what they're often finding is that they need to be able to have additional folks to draw on to both check their objectivity, to kind of brainstorm whether or not this is an accurate lay of the land. As you interact with people, it's easy to develop friendships and relationships, making sure that it's really data driven. But also to provide, search support. Things happen and the context shifts and the questions change. So maybe you were a great facilitator, but now you need a bunch of quantitative data. You need people who can jump in and collect and analyze and help do that, or social network analysis or process tracing or whatever that looks like.
Great, thanks, Danny. Shannon.
Yeah, I just add to that, it is definitely possible to do sort of use internal staff for this. Kind of 2 things to expand upon what Danny said. if there is a requirement for whatever reason from your funder, let's say that you have an independent evaluation, that obviously doesn't meet that independence requirement. So that's one reason to do an externally funded. The other is that perception of objectivity, even if you build in, having that surge support, someone else to kind of be the person who checks on your objectivity, because yes, as you become embedded, like you become invested in the program, and that's, I would argue, not a bad thing. But even if you have all those checks on your objectivity, there's still potentially a perception from others that this isn't very objective. And so that can undermine some of the recommendations. Again, if you're in those situations where you've got maybe a difficult finding or conclusion to kind of put forward. I would say the other thing, we have tried this internal to some of the teams I've worked on, and it's been really challenging because, people wear multiple hats and have multiple job duties. And it's very, very, this takes a lot of time. That's why we typically have someone whose actual job it is to be the embedded evaluator. That's their scope, because it's so easy for other things to kind of pull away from that. The important is sort of at the whims of the urgent. And so it becomes very hard to dedicate a person's time to that if they're getting pulled in a lot of directions. But that's not to say we shouldn't try it. I want to kind of make sure that people are aware of the trade-offs there.
Great. Thanks very much, both of you. Yeah, Chris, add something.
Yeah, could I just jump in there, Laura? Because this is such a good question about objectivity, right? Whenever you're trying to be an internal embedded evaluator who is also external, right? There's questions of objectivities and there's questions about your credibility, right? And so when we first started our DE in Indonesia, outside, like the Ministry of Health, the Indonesian Ministry of Health, thought that we would just be the same as the program team and that we wouldn't have any objectivity from the project we were embedded with. And then the project that we were embedded with, we're pretty sure that we were spies from USAID, right? And so I think that you handle that and you deal with it, right? A little bit is your overall position and what the mission says and does at the beginning can help with that. But then you deal with it on your own as you progress in the evaluation through the recommendations you deliver and how you deliver them, right? And there's really, you face this in traditional evaluation as well, right? So it's really not something unique to developmental evaluation, and really the solutions to it are not that unique either. That's what I jump in with.
Thanks, Chris. Great. Budget, before we kind of wrap up with a last bit of information and resources. So I saw that Chris added some resources in the chat. We will also be posting some more resources and sharing them afterwards along with the slide deck. But some ballpark figures or some ways to determine budget. Of course, with all the variation we've been talking about, there's not going to be one definitive answer. But would anybody like to speak to the question of how much a DE costs or could cost, and any other budget issues? Danny, I'm going to ask you to jump in.
Sure, happy to. So I think, again, the DE costs have just varied really significantly. And so I think what we found is that there's a high correlation between, the budget range and maybe the length of implementation. So we have seen a couple DEs for under $500,000. Typically, those are 1 year or less, and there's some questions about do they fully, are they really truly DEs? There's also a number of evaluations that are multiple millions of dollars that are in this kind of 5-year range, or even, Jalen's case, for example, that was more than 3 years and 5 full-time evaluators. So it really ranges. Most DEs that we've seen in the agency are somewhere between 500,000 and $1 million, and have lasted, say the 1.5 to 4 years. But there's a lot of factors at play. So the size of your team, the duration, whether you are looking at, national evaluators, if you have to pay relocation for anybody, things like that. So it varies pretty significantly. I will say, it is it is often not cheaper than traditional evaluation. It may save more resources on the programming side, implementation side, to be able to make that effective. But you do have to think through whether you have enough resources to really, typically you're paying for at least one full-time staff member, in addition to surge support and support members and things like that. I saw a question also on how do you budget for it. There are some resources out there, and we'll show those, I think, in a few minutes, about some guides and templates. Generally, you start with thinking through how many evaluators are needed and what type of evaluators are needed, and you start with that and you do that kind of labor, and then you usually work with a pool of surge support funding. So you kind of keep it basic that they can draw from as needed or not draw from as needed. And you have had a number of DEs that got extensions that weren't costed because the needs didn't arise as quickly in the process as they thought they would. So it really can take a lot of forms.
Great, thanks. And I see some questions also throughout the chat about both methods, quantitative, qualitative, or whatever, and we've spoken a bit about those, but also types of products, like what comes out, what kind of recommendations, what kind of learning products or final report products, what do they look like? Maybe just some examples, because we know there's a huge variety. Chris, I'm going to turn to you on this and ask about either on the data gathering side or on the sharing and engaging with findings side.
Yeah, I think I'll engage in your question on the sharing findings and recommendations, and this related to a great question that came from Kenneth in our Q&A, actually, and another great question that we received earlier, right? I think one of the ways you can judge the effectiveness of a developmental evaluation is whether or not its recommendations are used, right? Now, your traditional evaluation is going to deliver that report that may or may not be used and may or may not sit on the shelf, right? But what makes developmental evaluation truly different, right, is its emphasis on utilization, just by the fact that the developmental evaluator, he or she is there after they deliver the recommendation, right? And they should be advocating for the use of the recommendations that they use, right? So they're right there to help that program manager figure out how to use the recommendation, to look for an opportunity to use it, to lobby and advocate for the use and effectiveness of this recommendation, right? I think we've all received recommendations and reports that may or may not actually be accurate or feasible, right? But if you still have that evaluator there to help you use it, to identify opportunities to use that recommendation, it's much more likely to have an impact and have an outcome, right? And I think that's what makes a DE truly unique, that they're helping you utilize it there on that extra stage that nobody ever thinks about, right? And that's the actual utilization of the evaluation. So thanks, Laura.
Great, thanks. So we're going to turn now to the last slide or two to make sure that we get them in, and we will share the slide deck as well as other resources that may have been put in the chat. We will follow up with you all, but a couple of resources. So DEPA-MERL, the Developmental Evaluation Pilot Activity, Monitoring, Evaluation, Research, and Learning, it's part of Merlin, the MERL Innovation Mechanism. If you have any interest in proceeding through for a developmental evaluation through DEPA-MERL, you can contact either Danny or Shannon, both of whom are here, and Joyce Alele is another person you can contact for more information. DEPA-MERL provides the DE, the person, and then support around it, and then studies it. The University of Michigan and Search for Common Ground, they study DE as a method, and there are a number of resources that have been shared about that. So here are some more resources, some of them already put in the chat, but again, we will share the links by email as we follow up. And I think that might be it. Just to thank very much all of the panelists, and then on the back end, Sharon Meged and Kwabena Bwampong helping us run this whole DE. And any final thoughts, just to say thank you, Danny, Shannon, Chris, any other things we would like to say as we take our leave?
Love the Q&A. Keep those questions coming. Feel free to reach out. We're happy to send more resources along. There's quite a bit out there now and answer questions. We're glad to see the interest.
Right. Let's definitely be in touch. Thanks so much. And have a great rest of the day. Great weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.